Svenja, and it feels good to be part of the CHE series of talks. I began the Masters in Human Ecology at the Centre for Human Ecology on the 18th of September 2005, and the following 9 months were probably the most transformative in my life. I don't think I would be the person I am today or doing the work that I'm doing if it hadn't been for that course. And I think very fondly of the way that it was held, the sense of building, growing sense of community among the students was held by Verén and Verén Nicholas and Nick Wilding among the great cohort of students that we had. And among the option modules that I chose was one in food culture and agriculture. And really the approach that Crispin Hayes and Ulrich Löning were advocating on that module is very much in line with or attuned to the approach of the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, where I work at Coventry University. And I'm part of a teaching team on a module there that it's called Power, Participation and People's Knowledge. And it's led by a really fine scholar of Indian origin called Jasbir Singh, who has that same approach to participation and to care for students as I felt at the Centre for Human Ecology. And it feels great to be part of a team that is helping folk on their own transformative journeys, often through the medium of food, and something akin to what I experienced at the Centre for Human Ecology. My own research at the moment is much more desk-based and archival. And I'm just going to share my screen now. And so when I was discussing with Svenja and Luke about what I might share, we discussed the work, the research I'd been doing into how slavery-derived wealth was used to buy and maintain land in the West Highlands and Islands and control over populations and natural resources and ecosystems. And in particular, the report that I co-authored with Andrew McKillop of Glasgow University last year. And we also discussed the calls that are being made to decolonize Scotland, and in terms of what might that mean and how might it happen. And so what I've put together is something that I think might touch on both those topics. It's mainly going to be historical for a number of reasons, but towards the end, I'll try to make it more explicitly about the present. So I'm going to begin with the background to the clearance at Glencalvie. It's been well written about by John Preble and Eric Richards, among others, but there's quite a lot more in terms of the longer history of land ownership before the clearance that I've been working with, and actually I'd anticipated that this would be the shortest part of the presentation, but in fact what's going on is pretty complicated, and I can't pretend that I fully understand it at the moment. There are others, historians, who I'm going to be calling on for help to try and get more clarity on that. But I'm going to spend a bit of time on it because I think there's an important connection there between the background of land ownership and the influence of money from empire that is directly related to the clearance of Glencalvie. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the imperial connections of the landlord and of the factor, and then the enduring significance of Glencalvie and how that might relate to the question of decolonizing Scotland. So just for orientation, this is a map, a 19th century map of the north of Scotland. You can see there the Moray Firth, and then above that, the Dornoch Firth. And really there, if you follow the Dornoch Firth inland, you'll see a thick black line of the River Shin. And there are two well, there are three, but there are two main rivers branching west from that. We're dealing with the lower one of them. That's the River Carron. Coming a little bit closer in, if we can. You can see here the Dornoch Firth and the green swathe of land heading west at the mouth of the Firth. The first green swathe of land is the River Carron. And John Preble described it as being like an arm with three fingers at the end of it. Well, the finger that's pointing directly down the way is Glencalvie. And here again, you can see it more closely. And at the mouth of the glen, there's a slightly green area at the head of the glen, and that was called the Urla, or the ground of Glencalvie. And I think most of the agricultural activity and probably residence was in that area. And then going north from there onto the kind of main stretch of the glen again, you'll see just to the west. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but the arrow there is now pointing at Croick, which is where the church was, which played such a significant part in the clearance. So Glencalvie came to Scottish national consciousness as a result of a petition in the Scotsman in April 1845, to which was attached the names of two of the Free Church ministers, the new Free Church that had been established in 1843. And the petition said there were 90 poor tenants and cottagers in Ross-shire, just about to be removed from their humble homes and left to seek temporary asylum in a churchyard, make the present appeal to a benevolent public for relief. And they said that although they believed their land to be in the grasp of powerful invaders, nevertheless they meant to be obedient to the law. And their minister, Reverend Gustavus Aird, who was a significant figure in terms of the Free Church and land reform in the second half of the 19th century, wrote in the petition that matters here have really come to an awful pitch when beings possessed of immortal souls, originally created in the divine image, are driven out of their homes and their fatherland to make room for fir and larch plants, deer, rose, moorfowl. His be the blessedness pronounced by heaven on those who consider the poor. The following month, this report was followed up on by the Times, who were doing, I suppose, political campaigning work on reform of the poor laws. And they sent a special correspondent to Glencalvie, who wrote a very detailed and powerful series of articles on what had happened there. I think there's someone with their microphone on who's maybe having a packet of crisps. I wonder if they can put the microphone off. The special correspondent said that the landlord of Glencalvie, a man called Major Charles Robertson of Kindeace, was absent with his regiment in Australia. In fact, he'd been away for 5 years. He'd left in 1840. He'd left on a convict ship. Himself and 30 members of his regiment were the guard on a convict ship that left Portsmouth for Port Arthur in Tasmania, where there was a penal colony. And in the ship records, it says there were 186 prisoners on board. There were 10 men and 176 boys. And I was very struck on reading that about the scale of disruption and brokenness, individual and societal, that transportation in the British Empire, particularly in the 19th century, must have caused. There were 186 prisoners on board, and 176 of them were just boys. Robertson had left the estate in the hands of his factor, who was a man called James Gillanders of Highfield. And the story that the Times gave was that in 1842, the farms of Glencalvie and others were offered for rent, general offer. And when a constable who had tried to serve papers of ejectment on the Glencalvie tenants in 1843, they'd been deforced by the women of the glen and their papers had been burnt. At that time, the tenants had offered to match any offer that was given for the glen. But Gillanders, the factor, refused, and he held off with the clearance for that year, but he began proceedings again in 1844. This time the people agreed to go peaceably. And I'd like to come back later to ask how that transformation in attitude might have been effected in the 2 years between 1843 and 1844 or 1845. The Times correspondent found that the Glencalvie tenants were wholly without arrears of rent, and they'd even paid their rent during the famine period in the 1830s. This despite paying a rental of £55 per annum. And the Times correspondent commented, "I'm convinced that for the same land, no farmer in England would give no more than £15 for it at the utmost. Even respectable farmers here say they don't know how the people raised the rent for it." And given that there was an army pensioner in the Glen, and that it was said that the Glen had provided many soldiers for the army, I think we need to consider the possible role of empire in enabling the tenants to pay that high rent. So the Times correspondent added that Gillanders, the factor, had also been responsible for clearing 16 families from the estate of Newmore, and keep that name in mind because I'm going to return to it, as well as some 400 people from Strathconnell, as well as effecting clearances on his own estate in Roskeen. The historian Eric Richards commented that Gillanders had developed a reputation somewhat similar to that of Patrick Sellar, who was a notorious agent of clearance in Sutherland early in the 19th century. And like Sellar, and his actions and character were critiqued in the bardic tradition. And here's a poem on James Gillanders. Is Yerev Seamus Ahuchus, vi na Sheermalin Brúchel, Marava Henner Vohus, a Creich Saruska na Boch. James proved his inherited character as to be a brutal steward, like his grandfather before him, plundering and fleecing the poor. That's by Duncan Mckenzie, the Kinlochhew bard, and I'm grateful to Michael Newton for help with the translation. So the emphasis in the newspaper coverage at the time was very much on Gillanders of Highfield as the agent of the clearance, and that's probably well deserved. But there are court papers in the National Records for Scotland which show that in 1821, Major Charles Robertson was acting, he wasn't a major at that point, he was a captain, as a factor for his father, William Robertson. And he tried to remove tenants near to Glencalvie in a similar way, and was accused of deceit in his doings by the tenants. And I think the timing of this in 1821 is important, and I'll return to that later. The Robertsons of Kindeace were, according to the family histories, were originally from Perthshire and moved to Inverness as merchants at sometime in the 15th century. And they were there, they became known as the Robertsons of Inches. They weren't known as the Robertsons of Kindeace until the early 17th century, when they bought an estate called Kindeace near Invergordon in the north of the Murray Firth. And they continued to accumulate land there until the late 18th century. And in 1794, when the estate of the Rosses of Invercarron was being broken up, part of the estate was retained within the Ross family, but the Robertsons of Kindeace bought Glencalvie, Wester Greenyards and Easter Greenyards. And then in the 1820s, roughly in 1820, 1821, William Robertson, who was the head of the family at that time, became financially embarrassed and had to appoint a trustee to pay off his debts. And the estate, and this is where I come to some complicated stuff that I'm just relaying it as best I can understand. The estate had been put under a strict entail by his father, so that he got all of the estate, and then after provision for the younger siblings, any residual money was to be retained by William Robertson to buy further land, which would also be put under the entail. I think it was known as a strict entail. And this meant he was very restricted in selling off land to cover his debts. And the appointed trustee was a man called William Paul, an accountant, who was clearly very ingenious at finding ways to make money or recover money for the creditors. And there was a court case between him and Robertson of Kindeace over what he was able to sell in terms of the entail. And in the period, in 1823, at some point, Charles Robertson of Kindeace, his son, who later became Major Charles Robertson of Kindeace, bought Glencalvie and the Greenyards from his father. And this does seem to have been a genuine sale. There's even a price that goes with it, almost £8,000, about £7,800. And the question that opens up is, how could Charles Robertson, a young man from a financially embarrassed family, afford to pay around about £8,000 to buy an estate? And I think the answer to that is that in 1816, Charles Robertson had married a woman called Helen Cruikshank, who was the daughter of Patrick Cruikshank of Strathcathro, who had died when Helen Cruikshank and her sisters, she had 2 or 3 sisters, was still a girl, and had left her on turning 18, and his will had left her £10,000. So I think that the £8,000 that was used to buy the estate was from her dowry. And there's also, I think, some evidence to suggest that that's what happened in a say-sign, a land register in the 1840s on Glencalvie, in which the landowner is named not just as Charles Robertson of Kindeace, but also his spouse, Helen Cruikshank. I think that's probably there as a way of protecting her interest in the land. And the reason that's important in terms of imperial connections is that Patrick Cruikshank of Strathcathro, Helen Cruikshank's father, was a member of a very prominent slave-owning family in St. Vincent. And they had several plantations there. Moreover, in the family records in the national records of Scotland, Charles Robertson is down as being a co-owner of an estate called the Montrose estate, along with a man called Mackay of Big House and 2 brothers called Ramsay. Now, they'd all married these sisters. They were the husbands of 3 or 4 sisters. I'm not sure if both the Ramsays had married a sister, or whether it's just one had married one sister, and the other was there as representing his brother's interest. But these 3 sisters had owned an estate in St. Vincent called Montrose. So it seems that by the 1820s, not only was Charles Robertson of Kindeace indirectly benefiting from slavery through his wife, but he directly was a slave owner in St. Vincent himself. In addition to his own direct slavery wealth, 2 of his uncles were involved in the plantation economy in the Caribbean, one in Jamaica and the other in Demerara. And his cousin, Divvy Robertson, was a partner of John Gladstone, who was the father of William Ewart Gladstone, the late 19th century statesman and Liberal Prime Minister, who, and under whose government the crofting laws of 1886 were enacted. John Gladstone was one of the single beneficiaries of the compensation fund. He had huge slavery interests in the Caribbean, and he was married to Divvy Robertson's sister. Her great-grandfather was a Robertson of Kindeace, and the families socialized together when they were in London. I think that land ownership in the East Highlands of Scotland may be even more saturated in slavery-derived wealth than in the West Highlands. The report that Mackie, Andrew McKillop and I produced last year has shown that 2/3 of the land of the territory of the West Highlands and Islands was owned or maintained by people with slavery-derived wealth. Many, not all, there were a lot of native families involved, but many of these were part of the new elite. They were new to the Highlands and Islands. I think what's happening in the East Highlands, and I don't have the same sort of scale of evidence for it at this stage, is that existing families who were more heavily involved in the slavery economy were buying from each other. And I think the Robertsons of Kindeace are quite a strong example of that. The other sort of main person involved in this, James Gillanders, well, the estate at Newmore that he was also clearing on at the same time as he was clearing Glencalvie was owned by his uncle, a man called Francis Mckenzie Gillanders. And Francis Mckenzie Gillanders had returned to Scotland after a career as a merchant in Bombay in India. And he'd been a partner in a business there called Arbuthnot Gillanders. They were an independent company, but they had been financed and were effectively a subsidiary of Sir John Gladstone's worldwide trading empire, his network for domination and exploitation as part of British imperialism. And his Francis Mckenzie Gillanders, one of his main roles as part of that was to obtain indentured labourers and ship them to the Caribbean post 1834 in order to take the place of the emancipated slaves on John Gladstone's plantations in the Caribbean and Central South America. And it's clear that from the family letters that he did that by unscrupulous and deceitful means, and that some of the people who were going, poor, sometimes landless Indian families or small farmers, weren't aware of the conditions that they were signing up to and that they were going into. Francis Mckenzie Gillanders, was writing to John Gladstone using the kind of language, well, he described the people as lazy, he described them as not used to work, and that Gladstone would need to keep an eye on them because, in Francis Mckenzie Gillanders' words, there was more of the monkey than the man in them. So it's a very strong example of the kind of race-based assertion of cultural superiority, which was very often used as a justification for British imperial activity and forms of oppression. Francis Mckenzie Gillanders' father and James Gillanders, who cleared Glencalvie's grandfather, that's the man mentioned in the poem, was a man called George Gillanders, who came to Lewis from Aberdeenshire in the middle of the 18th century to be the chamberlain or factor for Mckenzie of Seaforth, who himself was a slave owner in the Caribbean in the late 18th, early 19th century. And it's clear from some of the literature at the time that Gillanders was exploiting his position in Lewis, taking some of the best land and engaging in fairly unscrupulous activity with some of the tenantry. And it seems likely that it was by those means that he was able in later life to return to the mainland and to buy the Highfield estate that the family took their name from. So there's another section here, I'm just conscious of time, that I'm going to pass over in terms of its significance and the religious and spiritual dimension of it, and in particular of this very well-known engraving, I suppose, in the window at Glencalvie, which it says, Glencalvie people, the wicked generation. And I just, although I'm not going to talk about it just now, I just want to share it and also thank Mary Gunn from Aotearoa, New Zealand, for allowing me to use it. It's a very haunting image. So in terms of its enduring and contemporary significance, it still works on us today. So when the decanter from Croick Church that had been used to feed milk to babies while the Glencalvie people were in the graveyard was transferred to Inverness Museum, it had been in the family of Dollan Macmillan from Achnagart in Glenshiel, whose ancestors had been evicted from Glencalvie. When that was given by the family to Inverness Museum, it made it onto the BBC, as you can see from this slide. And Kate McCulloch of the museum, who's now studying creative ethnology at Heriot-Watt University, was one of those who researched the history of the families involved, and I'm hoping to get in touch with her to see if I can learn more about what was happening in Glencalvie at that period. Another recent representation came in this book, Who Built Scotland? 25 Journeys in Search of a Nation. The novelist James Robertson, who wrote The Testament of Gideon Mac and The Land Lies Still, is a great-great-grandson of Major Charles Robertson of Kindeace. And in relation to Glencalvie, he wrote a chapter in this book in which he's full and forthright in his repentance of his ancestors' actions. He said, "When I was a boy and those stories came among us, vague excuses were sometimes wafted like bad smells. William Robertson had been in London, Charles Robertson in Australia. They hadn't known what was happening. It was all the fault of that monstrous man, Gillanders. But one of my forebears authorized the deed, and his heir married his daughter to the monster. Major Charles Robertson's daughter married James Gillanders. His other daughter married a man called Alexander Hamilton, whose first wife was the heiress of a slave owner in, I forget the island, I think it might have been Tobago. But he then concluded they were neither ignorant nor innocent of what was done in their name. They were responsible, and there's no disguising it. But in relation to his ancestors' involvement in empire, he's less clear about responsibility. He wonders if some of the Glencalvie people went to Australia where, I'm quoting, their laird, Major Robertson, was serving the empire. And more strikingly, he writes, the family's deep engagement in the burgeoning British Empire brought considerable rewards, but sometimes at great cost. In the second half of the 18th century, Charles Robertson, the fifth laird, had 9 sons who survived infancy. 1 inherited the estate, 1 had a career as an army officer, and 2 went into business in London. The other 5 all died overseas, 3 of yellow fever, 1 in battle in India, and 1 of lockjaw, occasioned by the biting of a snake. Elided from this version of the story is the wider human cost of the family's deep engagement in empire. At least 2 of those who died of yellow fever did so while enslaving and oppressing Black Africans in the Caribbean plantation economy. Their nephew, James Robertson's great-great-grandfather, Major Charles Robertson of Kindeace, appears to have continued that tradition. From family letters, it's clear that rather than the family serving the empire was there to serve the family for aggrandizement and enrichment, and for much of the 19th century, it served them fairly well. And just some concluding thoughts. The eviction and mistreatment of Gael in the 18th and 19th centuries is not comparable to the near total dehumanization of Black African slaves in Britain's Atlantic colonies. However, what's becoming evident in the context of the Gàidhealtachd is parallels in agency and attitude between imperial actors in the empire overseas and within the Gàidhealtachd itself. Indeed, it was often the same people who were carrying out these different forms of oppression, but always justified by the same principles: right of a return on capital, sacred right of property, their justificatory belief in their cultural and or racial superiority over the peoples that they oppressed. The perspective that I've shared on the history of the clearance of Glencalvie shows that we need to become still more aware of Scotland's role in empire, of how the country became saturated in wealth derived from the colonial exploitation of others, and of the consequence of that imperial role today. This may help us to come to acknowledge those consequences and to make repair in relation to contemporary inequalities and injustice derived from that history. That's a critical part of decolonising Scotland. Moreover, what Glencalvie shows is that those systems of exploitation and domination and the men who took agency for and from those systems were also at work within Scotland, with consequences that have also been devastating. And that's why I think that when we consider the decolonisation of Scotland, we also need to consider the country's internal colonisation, or to adopt the language being used by prominent individuals at the time, domestic colonisation. Understanding the history of the Gàidhealtachd in this way, and I'm speaking now as a Gael, can help us to understand the conditions and the force behind Dr. John McInnes's powerful words that Gaels exist in Scotland today as the detritus of a nation. Reassembling and regenerating from that detritus is also part of decolonising Scotland. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. Well, we need to let that settle a little bit before we move into questions. If folk have a question, you can either raise your hand on the little blue symbol, or you can type your question in the chat, and we will ask you to unmute yourself to ask a question to Ian. So the first question is from Valerie. Would you like to unmute yourself, Valerie?
Can you hear me? Hello.
I can hear you, Valerie, yes.
Okay, sorry. My microphone is going in and out. Yeah, so I was just wondering, is there a paper associated with the research you've been talking about today?
There is a paper, a co-authored paper with Andrew McKillop, a historian at Glasgow University, in relation to the research on the West Highlands and Islands. But in relation to Glencalvie, no, I've written nothing up yet. It's all quite raw, and I've tried to be sort of tentative in some of what I've said, because I'm a lot of the legal stuff is frankly, it's beyond me, and I need to get further clarity from experts in that particular field before I consider putting anything to paper. But I hope something will come out in due course.
Okay, oh, great, thank you.
Any more questions?
Ian, could I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes, Alistair.
Hi. Sorry, I'm moving around here because I'm meant to be doing the cooking. Ian, could you comment on the spiritual context in this? I know it's something you've been looking at and that you weren't really able to form conclusions about, especially with the role of Dr. Gustavus Aird and where he stood in this. Might that be something you could share some thoughts about, if you have tentative thoughts around it?
Yeah, it's very difficult to know. I might share my screen again if you will permit me, because there's a couple of quotes that where is this now? I find this very difficult to come to any conclusions on, but there's something quite profound in the fact that in 1843, when the constable went to the glen to serve the papers, he was divorced by the women, which was quite a common theme in resistance to eviction in the 19th century, and his papers were burnt. And then a year, perhaps 2 years or a year later, the people accepted that, and you have this pathetic inscription in the window of Glencalvie people, the wicked generation. Now, David Craig, in his book, and it's an excellent book in many ways, on the Crofters Trail, and James Robertson in that chapter, both suggested it might be ironic, and they might actually be angry. This might be, I don't think that's true. I think that that's that is a genuine statement of some sort of internalization, self blame that has happened. And there is a quote from the Inverness Courier in 1854, just after a follow-up eviction on the same estate that was very bloody and very violent. And again, women were at the center of it, and they were horrendously treated by the law, by the forces of the law. And a correspondent to the Inverness Courier said, there was a great show of resistance at first, and in those fortunate circumstances, this is referring back to Glencalvie. The correspondent is saying this could have been handled differently. The violence needn't have happened in 1854. In 1845 at Glencalvie, there was a great show of resistance at first. He's talking about the burning of the summons. And in these fortunate circumstances, the late amiable minister of the Free Church in Kincardine undertook the task of paying frequent visits to the glen to reason with the people, and the result was the most desirable that could well be conceived. The summons were regularly served, and the factor was advised to let the people remain for another year, and that most, if not all of them, would doubtless remove of their own accord, as many were disposed to emigrate. By Whitsun 1846, all had removed peaceably. And I've not been able to find out yet whether the minister referred to as the minister of the Free Church in Kincardine is Gustavus Aird. It says late amiable minister. If that means that that minister has since passed away, then it's not him, because he was still alive at that point. But I'm not sure who the minister of the Free Church in Kincardine was. But there's also in a biography of Gustavus Aird, he talks about religious prosperity as being a genuine spiritual awakening, arousing in unregenerate souls a deep sense of sin and of the need for a saviour, such that the whole community become aware of a spiritual force of unusual power in its midst. And the question I'm left with is, did the theology of the Free Church at that time allow for oppression to be named but not resisted? That meant that oppression for the oppressed should be taken as a judgment on the absolute depravity and sinful nature of their unregenerate souls. And I don't know if that's the case or not, but something occurred between 1843 and 1845 to transform the attitude of the Glencalvie people towards clearance from resistance, towards acceptance. And another factor that may be relevant is that Gustavus Aird himself is a distant relative of the Robertsons of Kindeace and held different attitudes towards landed families depending on whether they were good landlords, and that also seems to be associated with whether they were traditional families or new elites. So I think that part of its enduring significance are those few words, the wicked generation, and how a previously vibrant and resistant people came to have their spirit broken, and that was the kind of terms that the Times's correspondent was using. And I'm very wary of making that claim, because I know that in the Free Church tradition, Gustavus Aird is held to be a very prominent and active land reformer. But I think that needs further investigation and work. Are you in the middle of the potatoes now, Alistair?
No, sorry, I lost you. You froze. You hear me?
Oh, did it freeze for everybody else as well?
No, it just froze on my end, I think. Okay. I just went upstairs and grabbed hold of this book. Can you see that there?
Send back the money. Yes, Ian. Yes.
Ian White. And I mean, what White is saying here, Ian White, a Church of Scotland minister who is, or at least was, a member of the Iona community. And he's saying that the Free Church, I mean, send back the money because of the campaign to within the church to send back money that came from slave plantations. And this book is about the Presbyterian, American Presbyterianism, and its central involvement with plantations. and that the Free Church therefore found an affinity with those oppressed elsewhere, but subsequently found itself financially supported by the southern slave states of America. And so White unpacks that here. And I just wonder how much that played into compromising the voice of the Free Church, which was otherwise, you know, in opposition to landed power, in opposition to landed patronage. And yet, because it's to get money for buildings and the Free Church College and so on, was clearly compromised at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's something I need to look more into, because there was some hostility in that part of the world between the Free Church ministers and the landlords, and it's clear from some of Kindeace's public statements that he was favouring the established church over the Free Church. There's even then, I suppose, a possibility that what happened in Glencalvie could be related, given the timing, to that. I don't have any evidence for that, it's just speculation. But yes, potentially a connection, and certainly something more for me to get stuck into.
Thank you.
Thanks. There is another question here, a few questions actually. So Duncan, would you like to unmute yourself? Duncan Simpson? Oh, okay, no problem. So Duncan has no microphone, but so he asks, perhaps one you have to run past the law. Yes, was Kinder's house built with the profits of slavery, I wonder?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I've not got there yet. I do wonder, given that he was buying all this land in 1794, Charles Robertson's father, and that two of the brothers had died in the Caribbean, where their money went, and whether that might account for some of the money that was coming into the family at that time. And also, but I don't know whether the timing of when Kindeace house was built, whether it would tie in with that. Again, it's something to read, for me to look at further.
Then there's a question from Joyce.
Well, I think Duncan then answers that in the chat further down, where he talks about the wicked generation. He thinks it's Matthew 16:4 from Wesley's New Testament, 1755, and the verse is, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh a sign, but there shall no sign be given to it, and the sign of the prophet Jonah, but the sign of the prophet Jonah, and he left them and departed." And that's certainly very powerful. So I think that could also help us to understand. It's one way of understanding why that particular choice of words was used.
Yes. Does that answer your question, Joyce? Yeah. So, Robert Swinfen, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you. Hi, Ian.
Hello, Robert. It's really nice to see you.
And you. Yeah, I was, you will not be surprised to hear, thinking more along the religious connections than the historical ones, although I love that detailed historical work that you're doing for us, and I think it's really important to keep going with that. But I was thinking about the comparison with the state of fundamentalist religion in many poor countries, particularly in Africa, which I know better right now, where I wonder if we could learn something from people who are looking at that and the way that it seems to function as a response to oppression.
Wow.
That doesn't, acknowledges that oppression is happening, but does not think the answer is to deal with it. And I think obviously speculating about the psychology of people in the past can get very, very difficult, but it would be interesting from a spiritual learning point of view to look at some of those dynamics that are happening right now. It's a completely different piece of work from the one you're doing at the moment, but I just wondered if you thought that'd be interesting for somebody to do one day.
Yeah, no, I'm just for background, Robert and I were on the master's course together in 2005, and Robert was part of my mentor group with Jenny Patient and Osbert Lancaster. So I haven't seen Robert for years, and it's nice to see his face here. I think there is co-learning going on, or certainly learning going on in terms of, or looking at the parallels between land grabs in Africa at the moment and the Highland clearances. And I see no reason why some form of comparison couldn't be made between the kind of inner spiritual response to that and the role of religion in mediating these sort of massively disruptive social events and transformations. So I think it'd be fascinating. And if there is literature on it and you know of it, Robert, please do send some of it my way. Even if it's not for the formal study, I'd be interested to learn more.
I'll ask my wife. She's good at that kind of thing.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Andrew. Andrew, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, Ian. How are you doing?
I'm good, Mackie.
Good. I'm afraid I have a characteristically materialist and worldly question as opposed to a far more interesting question of philosophy. Just before I move on to that, it would be worth thinking about the fact that there may be less of a disparity between the apparent willingness of the population to oppose eviction than a rather, as we see, desperate sense of wickedness, and what exactly ministers are saying to those populations, ungodliness of resistance, particularly on material grounds, would be extremely interesting. That it could be a way of thinking about minister and clergy's reaction to physical resistance as passing on a particular message. So it may not be a gradual loss of confidence, but rather a sudden coming off the back of it. My question is actually, what is Robertson of Kindeace doing in Australia? It is the 1840s, and it is the expansion of the are we looking at Gaels and enslaved Africans and probably Aboriginal people, all on the receiving end of the Robertsons' colonialism? Major doesn't head to Australia with 10 men and 100 prisoners. He leaves that lesser people. He worked out what he's doing there for his own private purpose in that quarter of the world.
No, you were breaking up slightly when you're making the point about resistance, and I'd like to come back to that. I'll maybe have a chat with you about it separately afterwards, because I think it's very relevant. I did follow a little of that. He was there for 5 years. He was a justice of the peace in the island of Van Diemen's Land from 1842 onwards. He was he was on the committee of a Sunday school in Port Arthur in the same period. But the kind of big stuff, no, I've not been able to find that. I think that might be in some of the letters in the national records of Scotland, if it's anywhere. And it's a question of now being able to get back there with the restrictions being lifted. So I might get more on that. But I mean, he certainly had a fairly full social life when he was out there, which suggests he may not have been there entirely on military business. But 5 years is a long time to be away, particularly when you're very active politically, as he appears to have been in the Highland context as well.
Thanks.
You.
You happy with that answer?
Absolutely.
He'll get me later.
I'm sure. There's a few more questions here. One from Margaret asking about poetry, about the clearance in that area. Margaret,
I don't know much, Myra. There is a poem, and it's given in translation in John Preble's book, and it's given in the Gaelic original, in the whole of it's given in the Gaelic original in Alexander Mackenzie's History of the Highland Clearances, and that's by this Kinlochhew bard. I think his name is Hector Mckenzie, and Michael Newton has an, I'm not sure if it's another version of it, but has a version of it in his book, Shenachí na Cuille, and he has a full translation, English translation of that. I don't know of any other poetry pertaining to it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. There might be others who have more of a specialism in that might be able to help. But there's certainly that one very strong, very strong criticism of Gillanders in particular, and recognizing the family history of oppression, you know, going back to the grandfather. It's quite a strong one.
Thanks, Iain. I'm at Deacon.
How's the hay? More on time.
thanks. There's one question from Lisa. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, that was a really interesting talk. Thank you. My question is related to Croick, where I've recently started reading a little bit about the land struggles locally here, partly because I was commissioned to write some pieces of poetry about it, and there's a very strong local tradition that says this is how things were. And then when I started looking into it, actually there are a number of inconsistencies, and there's some academic papers about it that don't appear to back up what people think locally, or what people are very sure locally happened. In particular, the role of the women, in that people here seem to think that was very unique, and yet a look at the papers seem to indicate that that's not unique at all, and that happened in quite a number of places. And I've read differing theories on why that is, why particularly the women. Some people seem to think that they had less to lose, or that there was a perception that the law would be kinder on them. Or some people seem to think that it was actually a story made up by the sheriff officers who were thwarted, and who, no, in fact, that was the part about how it was actually men dressed up as women, but that was just the sheriff officers saying they would have been embarrassed if it had been the women who had beaten them. Anyway, there seemed to be a range of opinions about why the women particularly. But then one of the papers I read, and I think it was a PhD from Glasgow Uni in '96, it drew a direct link between the events in Croick, which were 1852-53, and the writer, whose name is Christine Lodge, she appeared to say that the fact that the uprisings in Croick were successful, in that nobody was any form of punishment, and the clearance was aborted. Sorry,
it's difficult to follow you, Lisa. The sound broke up a little bit, but I'm following it. I am following it.
So they seem to be saying it encouraged both sides, and encouraged future crofters in their struggles, and that they now believe things could be won. But it also encouraged the factors and the landlords in making sure that success could never be possible again. And I wondered if you feel that there is a possibility that such a causal link exists.
What year was the Croick, the Croick women's resistance in Croick?
There seem to have been several waves of it. I can't remember exactly. I think they tried 6 or 7 times to clear over a number of years, but I think the main events were 1852-53.
Yeah, there. In my reading, I came across something where they were, I don't know whether it was in Eric Richards' book or somewhere else, maybe in one of the.
Yes.
Yeah, was he saying that I think he said that the Glencalvie people or the Greenyards people had been encouraged by what had happened in Croick. Maybe that was one of the ones that you read.
It was.
Certainly, in the literature, it seems that well, I mean, first of all, the piece that I've read on this that I enjoyed the most is Hamish Henderson's chapter in the Celtic Consciousness book. If Alistair can leap about the place grabbing books, I suppose I can too. This book, there's a chapter by Hamish Henderson called The Women of the Glen, and he talks about the hidden world of Celtic matriarchy, and it's great stuff in there, and he draws it right the way through from some of the earliest sources to the resistance in the 19th century. It would probably be called essentialist today, but it's a brilliant read nonetheless and well worth looking at. I can't answer the wider point other than to say that what went on at Greenyards in 1854, it sounds like it was really pretty awful. It seems to have been mainly the women who were targeted, and many of them had very bad injuries to the backs of their skulls. The implication being that they were running away at the time, that the resistance had been broken and the law just went in to show them who's boss. So I do think that certainly in that case, it was time to show for the powers of the law to show, who was in charge. The other part of that is that according to Richards anyway, and is the last main clearance. There aren't any big clearances after that. So it could also have frightened the landlords to some degree, that they realized they couldn't do that or get away with that again. And there does seem to be evidence, even in the Robertson of Kindeace case, that they began to then just try and pick on small numbers at a time, 2 and 3 here and there. And that was how they picked things off. So it was done, 40 were cleared, but it wasn't all in one go. It was over the course of 10 years. And that attracted less attention. But as to the role of the woman, there's definitely something there. It's something that's worth exploring. And I think Hamish Henderson writes really, really well on it.
Thank you, that's brilliant.
Thank you. And then Anne has her hand up. Anne McCaskey, would you like to unmute yourself?
I've just had to write up on a project and decided to write about Glendale Estate because I live near there. But what I was wondering is, this is 1845. Now, the Battle of Brace was 1882, and then Glendale Estate, when they stood up to the authorities, that was 1883. And then the Crofters Commission eventually, was it 1884 to eventually, or was it 1886 that it came about? But what would have made it in the intervening 30 years? Was it just because of this happening all over the Highlands Islands that it eventually came about that the Gladstone eventually decided to set up the Royal Commission then, do you think?
I think, so there's some work being done on the kind of wider changes in political economy at the time. And there was a very strong sort of free market ideology in the first half of the 19th century, but then there was a shift in the second half of the 19th century, possibly under the influence of forms of romantic philosophy or German philosophy, which emphasized the virtuousness of the peasantry or of peasants. And within that, greater sort of rights and protections were being given to non-rational forms of agriculture, as the political economists would have it. And so when contention happened, which wasn't so much about clearance, but more to do with the loss of grazing rights, or people being kind of moved into areas, there was much stronger support, a much stronger social support. There was also, I think, more networks developed between different groups, and particularly to some degree between Scotland and Ireland in that 1870, 1880s period. There's a guy called Andrew Newby who's written quite well on that. Jim Hunter's work on the making of the Crofton community, I think, draws a lot of that together very well too. So there were multiple things going on that meant that when sort of systematic and networked resistance began to happen on Skye, there was a much stronger response from the executive. And I think Gladstone's own family ancestry, he sort of realized. Alexander Mckenzie, who wrote the history of the Highland clearances, was also the editor of the Celtic magazine, and he sort of cultivated Gladstone. He did family histories and genealogies, and he showed how he sort of sent them to Gladstone and said, look, this is, we're family sort of thing. And so Gladstone, I think, had an affinity with the Highlands, and when this stuff started to happen, he took it more seriously than perhaps a different administration would have had. So there's not a simple answer for it. There's a lot of different factors, but that's some of them.
Thank you. And Myra Stewart was saying about the poetry, but when I was trying to find out about the Glendale estate, and then there was a poem quoted in something I read, and there's I think a book that Professor Meek has written that is I certainly wouldn't be able to understand it, but I think it's poetry Bartach from the time of the clearances related to them. So
yes, I didn't mention that to Myra because I'm sure she already knows about it, but that it's called Stressa Tua in the Chiarna, and every poem that's in it, and there are a few that refer to Glendale, every Gaelic poem that's in it is translated into English. So you will, if you're not a Gaelic speaker, you will be able to follow it, and it's very, very useful. It's well worth getting hold of. And in fact, sorry, in fact, there's a colleague of mine, he's from Glendale originally, James Oliver. I don't know if you know James, maybe his mother.
I know Bem, Katrina.
Katrina,
Yeah.
he's doing some research into Glendale as well. So you might want to put your heads together, and you might be able to help one another in your journey.
Well, I'm married to a local, but everything that I tried to read what I'd written about it, he just said, that's not true. Where did you get that from, etc., etc. So
that's good history from the ground up.
It wasn't an advantage.
Thanks. Thank you, Anne. We don't have any more specific questions in the chat, but we've got a few general comments. Would anyone like to ask any other questions to Iain before we open up for a more general discussion?
I'm seeing Ul has got his hand up, Svenja.
I need to unmute. Can you hear?
I can hear you, Ul, yes.
Okay, hello anyway. Great
Hello.
that you're carrying on the good work this way. We haven't been in touch for ages.
Nice to see you.
You raise a very contemporary issue, actually, which is the neo-colonialism that's happening now in agriculture and climate change and everything, where we expect what used to be the colonially dominated, in the land sense, colonially dominated empire is now economically dominated in almost the same way. And I just wonder, you probably have some general comments. We need to take lessons from what has been done. And part of those lessons is the memories we put up. Are there statues to some of these horrible people? And is there a move to pull them down? I'm not in favor of pulling down the statues of criminals in that way, like the Clive of East India, whose statue was knocked down in Bristol, was it? I think they should stand as a reminder to what used to happen. But, you know, that's a personal opinion, and other people have the opposite opinion, that it'll attract neo-fascists and so on. But where do we stand and what do we do next? That's one of the main jobs CHE is going to have in the future.
Yeah, I remember having a chat with Mike Small from Bella Caledonia and lots of other good things as well.
I know Mike, yes.
And we were talking about one of the statues in Edinburgh, I think on Calton Hill, to, it may have been Nelson or someone. And he was saying knock it down, and I said, well, let's build another 3 people on it, and every quarter, one quarter we can have Nelson, the next quarter we can have one of the 13 or 14-year-old boys who was there kind of as cannon fodder, hauling the cannonballs around the deck. The next quarter we can have one of the prostitutes that have been taken on board to give the full dirty, really horrible reality of what was going on in those ships.
So it's a positive use of statues for that history.
Yes, in the case of Kindeace, I don't know that there's any commemoration of the family. The big one, of course, is the statue on Benvragi of the Duke of Sutherland and what should be done with that.
Yeah.
And also now, interestingly, on Iona, there is a statue of the Duke of Argyll, who rebuilt the abbey, but his, if I'm getting my generations right, I think it was his grandfather was married into slavery derived wealth. So that it raises an awful lot of questions about an awful lot of privileged characters in the Highlands and beyond that I think we can open up in a lot of very interesting directions. And I see that as being something for the Centre for Human Ecology to very much be involved in.
I do think somehow that history that you're working on needs to be kept alive. There's a huge lot to be learned from that. And incidentally, look at The Guardian for the last few days. A lot of universities are closing their history departments, and there's a big outcry against that. And I think human ecologists, I might write back myself, human ecologists should answer back. History is valuable, not only in the way you said, but also in the way it teaches us how to behave ecologically now.
Yes.
Go back to Darwin, and I've just lectured on Alexander von Humboldt, whom I had to study for the purpose. Been a great experience. And it didn't come into the course you got, should have done. Because he said all the great things that we now need. And have a reverence for nature, all things are connected. The colonialists are wrecking South America. He complained about them. He met the president of the United States, Jefferson, the great Jefferson. They got on extremely well as fellow botanists, except for slavery. Jefferson, as a matter of course, had slavery. And Humboldt said, he didn't say directly to the president, he's politically polite, but in a way he should have done. Slavery was the thing he couldn't stand. And all that is history, old history, good and bad. And there's a case to bring it all back in whatever form it arrives at that you can discover.
Yeah,
so thanks very much. It's a terrific study, yes. Great.
Thank you, Ul, and it's great to see you, and
yeah.
Good love to you.
Okay, well, we'll meet up whenever it's possible. Where do you live these days, and how?
We're back on Skye.
You're
back living on Skye.
Right.
So next time we're down your way, yeah, I'll call in.
Call in. Yeah, we're there. We've moved a few yards down to what was the stables is now an eco house, where I'm speaking from.
Lovely.
And it's fine. Okay, so look forward to seeing you.
That's great. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Ulrich. So a couple more people have their hands up. Drew McNaughton.
Well, morning, thank you, Iain. Glencalvie. I was wondering, because of the time frame you're talking about, it's quite interesting. You said that this was one of the last of the clearances. Put my hand down. And I'm just thinking, in terms of the imperial aspects that you're talking about, how this was kind of looking at the wider timeline of Victorian imperialism, how things started going more into the industrial, and wondering how what perhaps happened to the people that were cleared. Did they then have to, obviously a lot of people had to go and work in cities and work within this new sort of industrial complex, almost military industrial complex, actually, which was really sort of fueling the empire. And just in that context, you might be interested in that. I found out a bit recently about the history of Salmorostig and how the family, the noble family, managed to get quite a lot of their wealth, which was interesting, relating to shipbuilding and sort of armaments and things like that. So, you know, I see this all as kind of like, you know, a continuum, you know, coming up to where we are now. And so that's why it's really interesting. You've got this historical perspective and you're sort of sharing that, and, you know, things are all coming together now, it seems. And I just wondered if, you know, what you might think about like the sort of later phases, like perhaps of what happened, like what was the post time of this, of these clearances.
Yeah, I think the connections are all there, and I think that's what Ul was speaking to, is that history is alive, and it's the way that we bring that into the present. I don't take the view that history sort of stands apart and is objective. I think as scholars, we're bringing a whole bunch of assumptions to our work that kind of almost that certainly influence, I wouldn't go as far as to say dictate, but certainly influence the kind of histories that we write. And I think as more and more people are becoming aware of the urgency of the ecological situation and the catastrophic dimension of the economic system that has led to this, we're changing our perspectives quite rapidly to look at the way that how those economic systems have created ecological catastrophe and cultural and social destruction for many different peoples. I think it's a really important change that's going on, and it's not just happening in Scotland. It's happening in no wonder the powers that be are trying to close down history departments, because it's a very important part of that transition, that transformation, I think.
Thanks. And we have another question from Jane. Would you like to unmute yourself, Jane?
I can, though I've put it in the chat already. I'm hearing some echo, sorry about that. It's really about bringing this to the modern day and how we see parallels today in how, you know, like Manifest Destiny, that American thing of spreading West and civilizing the West while actually exploiting it. Whether you think there's something similar in Scotland's approach to how it owns Gaelic.
Yeah, I think certainly in the last few months there have been certain political developments that presume a lot about what the language is for and who it belongs to, and I think that Gaels have an awful lot of work to do to shift the perspective on that, because the kind of general perspective is this is just a free-for-all, it's just a language. And I think we need to be, and this is not really the work of history, although history is part of it. We need to be showing what is there in addition to language, even after 400 or 500 years of colonization, disruption of material practice, cultural confusion, that this is not just a jumble of words that happen to be put together in a certain order. There's structure to it, and that structure relates to the way that we live and the way that we are with each other and the way we are with nature. And so I see that as being a very important part of human ecology and of the diversity of human ecologies that exist on the planet, of which the Gaels' relationship to nature is one very important one. For me, the most important one, but that's ethnocentric, which I hold my hand up to in this case.
Thanks. You happy with that answer, Jane?
And do you want to say more, Jane, about some of the work that you're doing with the Scríoch and what's happening in response to, for instance, the Gaelic crisis report that Croick and his team put out?
What's happening is a lot of filibustering at the moment by the board and by government. I was thinking of the network resistance and our own need of something equivalent to the Crofters Commission. There really does need to be, quite a radical rethink, because it's the parallels with the 1840s it's staggering. There's this notion of the special virtues of the people who are colonizing, in this case, a language, and a sense of mission, and a sense of destiny, and a sense of improving the natives. It's unsettling how parallel it is, and how destructive. And I don't think that is really quite understood, how profoundly destructive it is. But we are beginning to network and organize, but it's hard work, and it's hard work to draw people out of their crouch, because they're so used to being told who they are, from that external gaze.
And another parallel between the 1850s and now that is very strong, of course, is that the Shire is really being initiated and led by women. And that may also be a parallel with what was going on in the 1850s.
Even worse, a whole bunch of women. So it's really scary.
Thank you, Jane. And finally, Alistair's got his hand up.
I just want to make a final comment later.
Just very quickly, and it was building on Ulrich's former point partly, where Ulrich was talking about the need to hold on to history, however we understand that. But I mentioned the Free Church, the book about the Free Church and its involvement with slavery in plantation America by Ian White, Send Back the Money. And I should have added, and I just want to add now for the record, that I asked Ian, what did the Free Church make of it? And he said, well, they were very helpful in giving access to their archives. And I wanted just to note that, to show that institutions can move, times change, and we have to be careful not to push people into corners of the past that might prevent them from moving forward freely into the future. And thank you, Ian, for a wonderful seminar. And while he's there, thank you, Ulrich, for having originally held the framework in the Centre for Human Ecology that has made this kind of event possible today.
Thank you. Thanks, Alistair. Thanks to you both for eldership over many years.
Can I just put a final comment in? Can you hear? I don't know.
Yes, can hear you.
It has, my picture hasn't got a yellow frame around it. So the central issue is to ask basic questions, which you've done of the Highlands, what really happened, and interpret them. And we've all gone along with that. The ecologist, whose blueprint for survival is 50 next year, same as CHE. Teddy Goldsmith had questioning basic assumptions as his headline in The Ecologist, or some phrase like that. And I've been in touch with a lot with the man who started the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And he's just published this book with the same title, a basic rethink. And it's a very, very good book. Alistair and I thought we'd write a book on human ecology one day. This is essentially a textbook of human ecology. It includes a bit of the history, not of human ecology, I mean history in general. It includes our economics, our psychology, our view of the world, and everything, all centered around agriculture, because that is what has made civilization. It's agriculture, it's not industry. And I just recommend, if somebody wants to get hold of it, it should certainly be in the CHE library. Absolutely fabulous. And
That's
written
great.
in lovely language that's easy to read.
Thanks very much. I know that Patrick Krauser, the head of the Scottish Crofting Federation, is very, very fond of Colin Tudge's work and has invited him to the Crofting Federation's conference in the past. In fact, Alistair was there that year as well. So there's lovely connections being made there.
Right, good. That's great. So thank you enormously. And I'm glad to see there's a lively CHE discussion that we've just had. That's great.
It is.
Good.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who contributed, and especially to Iain. And yeah, it's been wonderful to have so many familiar faces mixed in with new ones. And yeah, as Iain says, our CG elders. So our time is drawing to a close. Luke has posted the link. Perhaps you can share it again. If you would like to keep up to date with any upcoming events and news at the Centre for Human Ecology, you can sign up to our newsletter. Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone again to make this time the evening before the election. I can think of any better way of spending tonight, delving into, you know, the depths of what came before and bearing that in mind as we choose what comes next.